Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
You're expected to have it all figured out by the time you turn 18. That's why society makes such a big deal about that age. But I had it all worked out by the time I was 14. By then, I already knew exactly who I was and who I would always be. Now I'm 29, making good money as an advertising copywriter. At 29, you can hide behind the security of your paycheck, using it to craft whatever image you want. But at 14, there's no hiding. At 14, you're whatever other people decide you are, and they'll remind you of it relentlessly until the message sticks. High school, that zoo of judgment, keeps its labels short and straightforward. My label was geek. Others were jock, nerd, freak, babe, or bitch. Rarely did a label stretch beyond 4 or 5 letters. That suited the labellers just fine. They never cared enough to look beyond the short and simple. The labellers were usually the ones excelling in sports and the blonde long-legged pom-pom wielders. Before I turned 13, I had innocently tried to take part in their outdoor activities. But by the time I turned 14, the futility of that ambition had been rubbed in with wonderful efficiency. The jocks made it clear on day one. Geeks don't do sports. They are not only bad at it, but they deserve to be ridiculed and bullied into understanding it too. At 14, I understood. By 15, I knew that I'd better read books and talk about them with geeks who read books too. I also knew at what table to sit for lunch and at what tables not. But most of all, I knew this. Beautiful girls were not for the likes of me. You did not date them. You just ended up with a red face and a sinking heart. When I reached the age of 16, I found out that dating plain girls was not only easier, it also made me feel a lot more comfortable. Anyway, the brain is a beautiful thing. While kissing and necking a braced and bespectacled plain Jane, it conjured up images of every fabulous thing I ever saw. Or more realistic, I ever almost saw. I first got laid on prom night. Marie had a great body, actually, but her face was ground zero after 5 years of relentless acne. She was intelligent, witty, and fun. But who needs those on the back seat of an old car after gallons of illegal beer and the sweaty dancing of a prom's night? Well, you get the picture. I went to college, and the only difference there was the larger number of geeks and nerds. It gave me just more plain girls to choose from. And I did. After a few months of shyness and hesitance. About that time, another law kicked in. Plain girls are more eager. They are also more loyal. Of course, they have to, as they have to do battle for each conquest. It teaches them to hold on to what they have. Same thing goes for plain guys like me, of course. But I was a slow learner. I kept trying to hop around, until I at last had to admit that it was no use to turn in one ugly girl for another. That's when I met Irene and went as steady goes. I know. I sound terrible. As if the beauty of a girl is the only quality to look for. But I am honest too, at least here. At that time, it was indeed the only criterion. And the law came down as hard on the girls as on the likes of me. You see, when you raise kids and tell them they can't have candy, candy will be the one thing they crave for all the time. When they play at other children's homes, they beg for them all the time. Same with me. I was a healthy boy with a healthy appetite. My hormones were tickled by high, generous lips and endless legs. And they were denied me. Let's say it made me dream of candy 24/7. Irene was a miracle. Under her straight, mousy hair dwelt a mind of mercury. I never again met a girl who could turn a gray, rainy afternoon into paradise, just with words and images, with little touches and butterfly kisses. And when she smiled, her plain, stub-nosed face seemed to catch a ray of sunlight. Of course, that is how I remember her now. Back then, being the one-tracked oaf I was, I just took it all for granted. As a matter of fact, I felt sorry for myself, punished to always be with girls like her. It is actually how I thought about her. Girls like her, a species, a faceless part of a faceless multitude. God, was I pathetic back then? Nowadays, I am so much more with it. Being a well-to-do single urban professional. I go to the gym. I have lasered eyes and a suntan. My apartment is in magazines. I wear Boss, Armani, designer jeans. I frequent 3-star restaurants, rock concerts, operas. I travel abroad, meet the rich and famous, okay, let's say the well-to-do and the local snobs. Isn't it lovely, my life? Yeah, exactly. Who am I fooling? Truth is that I do have all that. But one icy glance of a gorgeous beauty, and all of it slides off me like flesh off a skeleton in a horror movie. It leaves me as naked and ugly as 15 years back, fumbling, stuttering. Believe me, men like me don't blush adoringly. They sweat. Last year I met Marie at the school reunion. She had found a famous cosmetic surgeon who had turned her into Angelina Jolie. Then she had met a local zillionaire and wore the ring to prove it. I know. I should never have gone to that reunion. Yesterday, I saw Irene in a glossy magazine. She just had her first novel published. It went to the top of the seller list in a week. Next to her in the picture was her tall, dark, handsome husband. She smiled like sunshine. She made me sweat. Curse too. Then again, maybe I could use her name in conversation. Tell someone she had been my girlfriend, once. Wouldn't that make me look like somebody? I saw the magazine at the reading table in the agency, sipping a cup of latte. That's when I heard a laugh. People used to call laughter like that silvery. I won't disagree most of the time, but this silver had life in it, a pulse, a breath. And it belonged to the most stunning girl I ever saw. First thing was her smile. Hard to miss, as it shone like a 100-watt lamp in her dark face. Her complexion was chocolate, her skin perfect. My routine is face curve body eyes, taking 2 seconds to complete the round. All 3 stages were spectacular. She was gorgeous looking. Her eyes, well, I have ever since wondered how to describe her eyes, but I can't tell you. They touched me where I live, a profoundly unnerving experience. Her name was Claire, and she preferred her coffee weak and sweet. I did not find that out, of course. I was as usual still getting the knot out of my tongue when good slick old Arnie had already poured the coffee for her, complimented her on her name, asked her if she was waiting for the Fredericks of Hollywood casting session that afternoon, and had taken her on a tour of the premises. To be sure, Claire had walked in for an interview at the accountant's company that occupied a few floors beneath us. She had gotten out of the elevator on the wrong floor. 3 days later, I met her in the reception lobby. As we rode to our separate floors, I at last succeeded in asking her a question. She told me she had gotten the job of secretary to one of the mini bean counters. Somehow I kept bumping into Claire quite a lot in the next weeks, and I discovered that she was something I had never seen in a girl as beautiful as her. Claire was shy. She fumbled with her fingers, never raised her voice, and often looked down. Her complexion was too dark to see if she blushed, but I am certain she often did. Another remarkable thing was the formal and conservative way she dressed. She often wore Chanel-type suits that should have been on elderly Washington politicians' wives and wealthy grannies. Her skirts hardly ever left her knees free, her blouses were wide and buttoned up, her heels seemed either flat or less than an inch in height, and still she looked dazzling. It took me 2 weeks to ask her out for lunch. She declined. I felt the familiar tons of geek shit descend on me. She was very sweet about it, whispered her apologies, but she really had to refuse. It took me 2 weeks to ask her again. 2 weeks in hell. They taught me I would die if I did not ask her again, but also that I might really die if she refused once more. Yes, I had fallen in love with Claire. And no, she did not turn me down the next time. We saw a movie, well, I guess she saw more of it than I did. Then we had a few drinks and some supper. It all seemed wrapped up in a pink haze. But when I conjured up all my courage to kiss her, she offered me her perfect cheek. No need to bore you with the tediousness of our courtship. We dated quite a bit in the next weeks, but each date ended right at the doorstep of her humble apartment. Of course I tried to lure her to mine, but she never even seemed to acknowledge my suggestions. Then I made a huge mistake. One day we had a short and pleasant little lunch in the mall. On the way back, I tried to get her attention focused on a rather sexy outfit in one of the windows. It was a short, deeply red velvet dress with spaghetti-type straps. I suggested for her to try it on, and I was for the first time introduced to an expression I would see more of in the months to come: deep hurt, mixed with disappointment. She left me standing right there, and it would take me weeks to have her answer my phone calls again. Why did I keep courting Claire? She was like a Fata Morgana, those appearing and disappearing little oases in the shimmering desert. And yes, that cartoon-like man crawling in the hot sands was me. Or maybe she was more like a slippery fish in a pond, always escaping the cage of my hands. She drove me mad. Then, one day, she pushed me over the edge. We had a company party, a small celebration at the offices. So I asked Claire to meet me there and attended as my date. She agreed, and for days, I nursed these exciting thoughts about stunning my colleagues with my eye candy. She didn't show up. I phoned her all evening and the next day, but she never answered. Nor did I see her in the building. That was when I decided to forget about her. Or at least give her the impression I did, because I never could get her out of my mind for more than 10 seconds. It took her a week to call me. Her voice on the phone was thick with emotions. She told me she had panicked at the thought of going to the party. She could see why I hated her, but she had been too scared. She was so very sorry. She sobbed. She understood if I didn't want to see her anymore, but she had been so scared. In short, after she had sobbed and sorried for 10 minutes, you could wipe me up from the floor. Claire and I married half a year later. It was a very small ceremony as I was an only child with one surviving parent, my mother, and an aunt. Claire had a brother and a few cousins in Louisiana who did not bother to fly up. There were friends and colleagues. We took a honeymoon on the Bahamas. In the weeks after the time, she stood me up at the party. She changed a lot. I admired her for her courage, as it must have been hard for her to open up, to break through her shyness and accompany me to parties, wearing nice and sexy dresses. She had to make small talk with people she did not know. And, yes, she even came with me to my apartment afterwards. The first time I hardly dared ask. We had been to a company function, where she had easily been the evening's main attraction. By then the amazement of me having a girl like her on the arm had died down a bit, but her attraction to the male population at the party had only increased. The panting sex hounds didn't even bother if I was around to let their tongues hang down her body. It only made my ego swell with a feeling I had never ever had. The feeling of alpha male pride, I guess. And it went straight to my crotch. So, when she pushed me inside my apartment the moment I had opened my front door, I was as ready as the next hormone-ridden teenager. Too ready, maybe. Love me tonight, Leon. Before I change my mind, she whispered into my ear. I did just that. In the weeks after this first time, we had sex almost every night, twice in weekends. Claire had not been a virgin. She told me she had had a few young lovers in high school and college, but they had been as clumsy and new at it as she was. She learned amazingly fast. The intimacy of it all plunged us into the dream world where new lovers live, forgetting the world around us. We went everywhere together, feeling proud and self-assured. In bed we did everything by now. She also became more expressive, using words she may not even have known before. I never wondered where the shy Claire went. You know me by now. Because I was so very proud of myself, I took all the credit. All her changes should be written on my account. Me Tarzan, you Claire. It was 6 months after our honeymoon when fate knocked on my office door. We were working hard on a new campaign for one of our biggest accounts. We put in long hours, and in these last weeks, I had been traveling a lot. I tried to be with Claire as often as I could, but too often I could not. She never complained and was always as sweet as candy when I came home. I usually was all over her as soon as I was 3 steps inside the door. That morning, I drank coffee, reading a report we might need for the campaign. There was some scratching at the glass door to my office. I looked up and saw Everett M. What's his name from the mailroom? Everett is just out of his teens. We don't employ many, maybe 8 or 9. So few even that it might get the company in trouble. Advertising is still quite a white stronghold. Hi, Everett. What can I do for you? I smiled at him, clueless why he might want to see me. Sit down and spill it. I can see there is something on your mind. I love to sound magnanimous, although it might only sound like that to me. It sure did nothing to make Everett less nervous. He sat down in front of me. Why does she only screw tall guys? He asked. I just stared. Aren't we good enough for her? He continued and stared down on his fingers. My mind raced. What or who on earth could he mean and why ask me? Everett, I tried. I'm not sure I know what you mean. Everett looked up. His eyes were sad. Why does she screw the tall guys in here, and not me or Darius or Bryce? I had read some Kafka and felt myself slide into his crazy world. Who, Everett? I asked. Who are you talking about? He now looked puzzled. Your missus, of course, he blurted. Your wife. Is she too good for us? Or don't you allow her? She is herself short, for Christ's sake. An ice-cold rain soaked me. I tried to speak, but couldn't. I felt numb and removed from reality. I gasped. Then I rose to close the door. My knees hardly held me up. I returned to my chair, watching the guy's sullen face. Are you messing with me, Everett? I said. That is my goddamn wife you were talking about. He looked puzzled. Then his eyes widened, as if a sudden revelation came over him. Hell, he whispered. You don't know? What he told me then was so utterly weird and unbelievable that I twice felt the urge to punch him in the face to make him stop. I wanted to grab him and kick him out of the office, but I only sat and heard his words through a buzz in my skull. He tried to be cool about it. It almost sounded like a rap, but for me none of the words rhymed. He told me how he had picked up stories at the office. Stories about the stunning chick that spread her legs for everyone. Then, at the office party about a month ago, he had seen who she was. I remembered that party. I could not attend, being abroad. Claire had asked me what to do, and I told her she should go. No reason to stay home and be bored only because I was away. I remembered her sighing on the phone, and I gathered that her shyness made her feel reluctant to go. So, I told her just to have a look and stay as long as she had a good time. The next day she phoned me and said it had been okay. She has stayed an hour. Then she had taken a cab home. Everett had quite a different version of that party. Claire had been hit upon right from the moment she walked in, wearing an incredibly sexy dress. As he described it, I had no idea ever to have seen it before. Or since, for that matter. Claire had been offered a lot of drinks, and she seemed very much at ease, talking to some of the white guys from upstairs, which meant management and office talk. Everett said he had watched her closely as he had heard all the stories, and because he wouldn't often see a sexy chick like her close up. But after a while, he got distracted, and when he again looked for her, she had gone, only to return half an hour later. This seemed to have set a pattern. After her second disappearance, Everett got curious. He followed her the moment she left again in the company of Dan Johnston, the vice president of finances. They had gone to Dan's office and closed the door, so he could not see what they did. But sure enough, half an hour later they reappeared. The girl had gone straight to the ladies to restore her hair and makeup. The man had rejoined the party, and his wife, at once. After the party, the corridors had buzzed with excited gossip about Leon's wife having been screwed by management. And as the weeks went on, new stories were added, involving every white guy, single or married, who had any position of consequence in the company. When I had seemed oblivious of it all, they had supposed I knew. Maybe, they thought, I used Claire to get a promotion or something. Especially because, at the last function, 2 weeks ago, I had been there with Claire, and she had had herself screwed nevertheless. I gasped when Everett told me that. I remembered the reception. I also remembered that Claire had been very easy around my boss and the other guys from upstairs. They had chatted and flirted, and yes, I was quite proud of her. But I don't remember her slipping away. So, relieved that I at last found a flaw in his story, I told him that it all had to be rumors and bad-mouthing. He shrugged and stood. You believe what you want to believe, man, he said. But I saw her get screwed there with my own eyes. I also stood, feeling a sudden rage choke my throat. You saw? When? How? She never left and I was there. She went to the ladies 4 times that evening, Everett said, making a throwaway gesture with his hand. Only thing is she never went to the ladies. I stared at him. He looked back. Some sympathy crawled into his eyes. Sorry I had to tell you, man. I thought you knew. He turned and left me behind like an empty shell. That night, I did not know how to find the courage to go home. I left the office early, but only made it past the first bar to reach a second and a third. Together, they added up to a nice collection of deep and very empty glasses. At the third bar, it took me too long to understand that it was my cell phone ringing, but I got it the next time. It was Claire, and she sounded agitated. She asked where I was, and as I answered, my tongue got in the way. I looked up at the bartender, and he said Red Bull. I wondered what he meant. He took over the cell phone and gave directions. I slid off the stool. A cold splash of water caused Claire to swim into my field of blurred vision. I apologized, I guess. Next, I was in the back of a cab. Then I was riding an elevator. There were blanks, but in the end I lay stretched out on a couch that looked familiar. The lights went out once more. Mighty sledgehammers crashed into heavy metal drums, while little sweet curls of violin music meandered through them like poison ivy. Growling basses throbbed beneath it. Distant wisps of coffee aroma tried to reach my nose. I cranked my eyes open, expecting my head to float against the ceiling. I was as dead as a living man can be. Slender fingers pushed a mug into my hands, and the smell of coffee hit me hard. I sipped. It helped. It helped 0.001 points on a scale of 1,000, but it helped. It was a first little step on a journey across the world. But hey, you have to start somewhere. Claire smiled into my face. She sat on the other side of the kitchen table. I must somehow have found the energy to get up and sit there too. We were silent, drinking coffee, eating dry biscuits. My stomach heaved, but stayed put. What happened? She asked, her voice all mellow. Good question, I growled. The words sounded reassuringly like themselves. Something at work? She continued. Bad news? I stared at her. It all came back, like a screaming rat pack clawing its way through my guts. Bad news, yes, I said. Awfully bad. She looked worried. There are more jobs, honey, she said, putting her warm hand on mine. You are good, they all know. Not that, I answered. Then I could not go on. All the bitter words were there, but I could not get them out. The finality of it all stunned me into silence. It felt so incredibly surreal now. I shook my head as if to clear it from things that stuck to the inside of my skull. Later, I whispered. I stood and walked to the bathroom. The shower was heaven. Claire left for work. I called in sick. They didn't like it, in the middle of the campaign development, but I didn't give a shit. I just sat at the table, an empty cold mug turning in my hands. Then I rose carefully, not wanting to disturb the huge church bells in the dome of my skull. I cleaned up the kitchen and went for a run in a park near the apartment. The cool breeze helped, so did the exercise. My erratic thoughts did not help much, though. Not at all. Breakfast with Claire had subdued the urge to scream at her, attack her with questions, accuse her, hurt her. All that was left now was a numb feeling. A need to know, but also a fear to know. I'll ask her tonight, I concluded, and just thinking that took a huge weight off my shoulders. A weight that returned, of course, as the day progressed. When I was preparing dinner, my hands shook with fearful anticipation. The meal went all right, as far as Claire was concerned. She had walked in around 6 p.m., all fresh and bubbly. She kissed me for setting the table and making dinner. Then she took a shower and returned in a nice slinky dress to go with the table linens, candles, and napkins I had laid out. Me, I had to force each forkful down. She noticed, and I guess she supposed I wasn't all well yet. So I struggled through the courses and desserts until we arrived at coffee. That's when I could not keep the lid on it. Why? I blurted, and the word almost tore open the inside of my throat. Claire started at the sudden outburst. What do you mean, honey? She stammered, clutching the edge of the table with both hands. I gasped, already ashamed of the outburst. Honey, I tried again, almost whispering now. They tell awful things about you at the office. Claire's eyes widened. She looked surprised, not shocked but confused about what I might mean. Awful things? She repeated. What awful things? At my office or yours? I don't know. I closed my eyes, then opened them again. They say you screwed half the management at the last few parties of my company. When the last word slipped out, I already wanted to grab it and put the whole sentence back where it came from. But it was too late. Claire looked truly shocked. The hurt invaded her gaze, an expression I knew so well. It was the way she looked whenever I trampled on her feelings. And at once I felt a total heel. It hadn't been true. Of course it hadn't. How could it? Stupid fool. They say that of me? Claire said with a trembling voice. Her body leant back in her chair, as far away from me as possible. I only stared at her. And, she continued, now with a hint of frost in her voice. And you believe that? I sat there and knew I blew it. I only had this one story of a spiteful teenager. Goddamn it, maybe the boy just wanted to get back at white scum like me. Maybe he and his buddies had a grudge against Claire for fraternizing with the white bosses from upstairs. What had I been thinking? Look at her, man. Look at what you did to her. You goddamn oaf. Believing hearsay at a glance and accusing the only person in the whole world who had taken the immense trouble of falling in love with me. Bravo. Claire rose. She threw her napkin on the table and walked out of the room. I shook the daze off me and cried after her. She didn't respond and disappeared in our bedroom. As I reached the door, I heard the lock click. It was the most sickening sound I ever heard. I begged at the door. I knocked and whined. She didn't answer. I even called her cell phone and heard it ring in the kitchen. That night I spent on the couch staring into the darkness until it turned gray again with the light of dawn. I crawled out of the nest I had made and once more knocked on the bedroom door. It opened at once and I started to blurt out apologies. But they stuck in my throat when I saw the suitcases in her hands and the coat on her arm. Claire, don't. I cried, trying to block her way. She just evaded me and walked to the kitchen where she picked up her purse with keys and cell phone. Then she went to the front door, never even looking at me. I scrambled behind her, begging her to not do this, to stay, to forgive me, to talk to me. The sound of the door closing put an end to that. I sank to the floor and cried. The next day was as hollow as the one before. The night in between gave me maybe 1 hour of exhausted sleep. I avoided the mirror, the shaving gear, and the toothbrush. And I again called in sick. I also called Claire, about 1,000 times. She never answered. Around 4 in the afternoon the doorbell rang. I ran to it, almost stumbling over my feet. It wasn't her. It was a well-groomed gentleman in a dark blue suit. He asked me if the name he mentioned was mine, and I agreed. He handed me a big envelope and informed me that I had been served with divorce papers. He smiled. Then he left me standing in my robe and stubbles, staring at the large yellow envelope. She wanted nothing out of the divorce. She just wanted out. When I at last saw her at the attorney's office where we had to sign the papers, she hid behind her lawyer and never responded to my urgent pleas to talk. She just signed and left. I had no options left but to follow her example. I quit my job and not even care to find a new one. I just hung around in my apartment, watching TV and playing stupid video games. I felt very sorry for myself. One day, not a month after the divorce, I picked up my mail, sorting through it. There was an expensive, cream envelope. The handwriting stopped me, making my heart race. Inside was a formally printed card. It invited me to attend the marriage of Ms. Claire Gabrielle Beaulieu and Mr. Michael James Carter. The envelope also contained a slip of paper with a single line on it, written in the same hand as the cover. It said, "Honey, I always screw up, never down." Carter was my ex-boss, and by now Mrs. Carter's ex-husband. I never liked him much, but right now, I felt pity. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.